So yeah, 欢迎各位老师、各位同学今天下午的这个来听今天下午的演讲我叫做马凯之凯马莎我是今天这一场的主持人非常欢迎大家那这个我们都已经听了2场这个演讲系列 Haun Saussy 的这个演讲系列，我们已经听了2场，那我们非常期待今天第3场那这个我想 Haun 应该还有很多余力，还有很多东西可以谈所以我们可以非常期待今天的这个精彩的内容那这个我想我们就基本上是这个形式跟上次一样就是说先有这个报告大概1个小时，然后接下来有一个 Q&A 所以欢迎大家提问然后那个英文、中文应该都可以那个报告的语言是英文但是后面也可以用中文回应回答所以。这个今天第3场演讲的题目是The 汉字文化圈 Center Periphery and the Shaggy Borderlands or in Chinese 汉字文化圈中心边陲与野外那所以join me in welcoming Haun for today's lecture
Thank you. Thank you very much. I wasn't sure today if I should have said 野外 or 塞外 because that's really what we're talking about. But since Sai Wai has a specific directional component. Perhaps this one better? Yeah, this one? Here, I think now it's turned on, right? No? Me and technology. This way? Yeah, okay. Yeah, technology and me. Always an uncertain relationship. All right, so I'm picking up then from the other talks that I've been giving, and I apologize if you haven't had a chance to hear them. I believe they're made available, and I would still be very happy to have comments on any of those talks from any of you. So, continuing then. Arguing for the importance of translation as a literary dynamic in Chinese literature and in East Asian literature more broadly, I run immediately into some significant objections by intelligent, well-read people whom I respect. Wiebke Deneke, for example, contends that the modern-day concept of translation is blinkered by ethnocentric prejudice. Let's see, I think I have a little quotation here. Perhaps, hang on. Yep. Going too far. There we are. The Chinese script, as she puts it, explored dimensions of literary expression closed to alphabetic scripts and enabled a multilingual East Asian world without translation, unifying dialects or languages that were mutually unintelligible in speech but identical in writing. Her case is based largely on the Japanese practice of kundoku, or glossing of Chinese written texts, but the model would hold equally well for Korean or Vietnamese or indeed for different vernacular languages spoken within China, what are conventionally called dialects. She says, kundoku is not translation in any conventional sense because there is only one text, not an original and a translation. Also, most Japanese practitioners of kundoku were monolingual and did not conceive of Chinese texts as texts in a foreign language. Learning kundoku did not involve learning a foreign language. It simply required a certain kind of literacy training. Thus far, Wiebke Deneke. Yukino Semizu calls this glossing practice invisible translation. But for Deneke, that description does not go far enough. Translation is indispensable only with phonetic scripts, she says. If we take a logographic script as the norm, we see that phonetic writing has the very great disadvantage of making foreign texts impenetrable to those who do not speak their language. On the contrary, I quote again, educated elites in traditional East Asia had direct access to Chinese texts and audiences without the need for translation. Furthermore, she charges, the hegemony of the alphabet is an artifact of colonialism, ultimately going back to the Hellenistic and Roman empires and to the particular success of their heirs in the early modern period in spreading their script to the entire globe. Well, I think it is not too late to congratulate Chinese authors and script architects, too, for creating a space of tongwen and a degree of success in making their characters understood across a good part of the globe. But the Chinese cultural sphere is today a zone of interestingly contested identities, and perhaps nowhere more so than in Taiwan, where the question of how much the locally received ways of living and thinking owe to China implies broad social consequences. Is Taiwan, after all, a province of China? Is it a colonial dependency or an offshoot? And does anyone have the will, the ability, or the desire to talk back to the Chinese cultural sphere, rather than speaking only within it and according to its rules? In what would such a talking back consist, anyway? If we want to think about Taiwan as a society analogous to Korea or Vietnam, as a territory formerly held by China, but having experienced eras of domination by different powers, and indeed periods of self-determination, we will want to ask what corresponds in the world of script to the Korean Hangul, the Japanese hiragana and katakana, or the various Vietnamese writing systems, including present-day romanization. Those writing systems interact with Chinese characters, may have grown out of Chinese characters, but do not simply dissolve back into them. Peter Kornitsky, in a book I've already mentioned, carefully documents the varieties of vernacularization in and around China. When Chinese script traveled, it did not impose a standard pronunciation on its readers. Foreigners read the signs out in their own languages. The vocalization of a Chinese text could become an object of reading in its own right. That is, it might be captured in script and transmitted from one reader to another. Selected Chinese characters, used not for their meanings but for their sound values, might be mapped onto the sounds of the receiving language, as we have seen being done with the songs in the Yue and Bailang languages. Other, non-phonetic marks might be added to provide guidance in grammatical analysis. Eventually, a new writing system might develop out of these supplementary marks that accompanied, as in the Japanese term okurigana, the original signs. Or in other places where Chinese script coexisted with other scripts, educated vernacular readers developed strategies of substitution for mirroring the meaning of Chinese texts with the sounds and written marks of their own language. When Tang or Song Dynasty Uyghurs read texts in classical Chinese, they might perform a phonetic adaptation of the Chinese words to their local speech, or else substitute the words of the original with semantically equivalent words and terms in Uyghur. Similar techniques are recorded for Khitan and Jurchen readers. The Xixia or Tanguts developed their own writing, logographic and not phonetic, in emulation of the Chinese script, and translated a large part of the Chinese literary heritage, so that an educated Tangut individual, says Peter Kornitsky, would have been fully versed in Chinese literary culture and yet potentially not understand a word of Chinese. As Tibetans, Mongolians, Uyghurs, and Manchus had become acquainted with scripts unrelated to Chinese, perhaps the idea that a single character stood for a single concept was not persuasive to them. They more readily turned Chinese texts into texts in their own scripts through paraphrase and rewriting, not adhering to the model whereby the local reader merely performed a vocalization of Chinese script. And this is not all. The Yuanchao Mishi, of which I have a picture here somewhere. Well, maybe it will come along. Come on, Yuanchao Mishi. There. The Yuanchao Mishi, the private history of the Yuan dynasty, better known as Secret History of the Mongols, or in Mongolian, something like Mongkol un Nyocha Tobchaan. I don't speak Mongolian, I only pretend to. This Mishi uses Chinese characters to represent the sounds of the Mongolian language, much as the transcribers of the Kojiki and other early Japanese books had done. Chinese editions of the work supplied two parallel columns. You can see that happening here, both in Chinese characters, but one giving the Mongolian sound transcription and the other giving a semantic gloss in literary Chinese. No one can dispute the fact that the Chinese writing system has been used to produce both aspects of the secret history, but neither can anyone dispute that it is a translation between languages. The Mongol world, which, as you know, briefly stretched from Korea to Poland and southward to Vietnam, was certainly not a world without translation. As this wider set of relationships between Chinese texts and foreign publics comes into view, we see that the Hanzi wenhua quan has many different kinds of borders. If the transition from China to the daughter cultures of Korea, Japan, and Vietnam is apparently smooth, that with the cultures of the Northwest, West, and Southwest is rough and shaggy. Attempting to describe the Chinese script's sphere of influence through a negation of alphabetic writing as a world without translation simplifies by excluding both a lot of cultural variability and the many historical processes and practices through which reading methods come to be. The proclamation of an alternative world of communication without phonetic signs begins to look like the abrupt and authoritative act whereby the sage emperor creates commonality. Shu tongwen, che tongwei. Kundoku, that reading without translation as Denica would have it, or invisible translation as Shimizu would have it, is possible only after readers have acquired competence in the Chinese character. Did they reach that competence without reliance on sound? That seems improbably austere. Reading tended to be phonetic. People felt that to decode a passage of writing it was necessary to voice the characters somehow, although the particular pronunciation used by the authors of a Chinese text was without consequences. Few people traveled between Japan and China in the pre-modern era, so pronunciation standards tended to be set locally, sometimes on a historical basis, sometimes on a semantic one. The reader and his or her immediate culture decided. Texts produced in the cosmopolitan written form were performed and consumed in the vernacular. I'm quoting there John Whitman. Now, was this vernacularization a translation or not? Was it a passage into another language or an extension of the Chinese language to a new geographical and phonetic area? Peter Kornitsky sees things differently from Wiebke Denica here. Vernacular reading, according to Kornitsky, is nothing more than a process or procedure applied to a text. What comes out of this procedure, whether orally, silently, or in writing, on the other hand, is indubitably a translation. It is, however, what I am going to term a bound translation. The bound translation allowed you to read it aloud, but provided no explanation of the sense. The reader either had to have expert sinological knowledge or to consult other commentaries and exegetical works, thus far Kornitsky. Precisely. Vernacular reading was not intended to supply new content. For the content, the reader had to depend on his or her knowledge of other Chinese texts. It might be that the Japanese or Korean public had internalized the meanings of Chinese characters and passages to such a degree that they no longer seemed to be foreign. After all, we're talking about cultural relations developed over a millennium or two. But for purposes of critique and debate, it was always possible for someone to label vernacular reading nothing more than a translation that dared not speak its name. Ogyu Sorai, in the 17th century, for example, insisted that Chinese was a foreign language and should be read as such. Habitual equivalences between Chinese terms and Japanese terms needed to be questioned. I quote Kornitsky again, what was driving his arguments was his conviction that Zhu Xi and other thinkers of the Song dynasty had misunderstood and overinterpreted the classics. It was important, therefore, for Ogyu to be able to say that a reading was not simply local, the local phonetic clothing of an intemporal universal idea, but that it was an interpretation, an opinion, and thus something that might be displaced by a better opinion. Similarly, in Korea, quoting Kornitsky again, some scholars were very uneasy about the idea of establishing a set of official translations for the Chinese classics and printing them, for that would fix the interpretations of those texts for good, and it would leave scholars little room for debating them. Have I got another slide here? Yes, there we go. Let's see, in fact, I think I'm already up to yet another slide. No, well, that will come soon. Vernacular reading, says Kornitsky, surely worked. It gave you access to any Sinitic text, ancient or modern, and it subverted the Chineseness of texts by making them linguistically and orally familiar. But by becoming too natural, too familiar, it also subverted the reader's ability to decide what the meaning of the text was to be. In a purely descriptive sense, too, if communication with foreigners were to happen entirely without translation, if univocal meanings are definitely established, then some of the ambiguities and exploitation of ambiguities that surely happened in history must be ruled out. Whether something is a translation or not, whether a language is foreign or not, depends on what you are trying to do, what you are trying to prove. The dissident scholars just mentioned appealed to the foreignness of Chinese texts in order to unsettle their sedimented meanings. The claim of foreignness enables a kind of critique. According to O.W. Wolters, who may or may not have a revisionist axe to grind, because I'm quoting him from another book and haven't gone to Wolters' own work, the literate elite of pre-modern Vietnam did not actually believe the Chinese classics. Instead, they cited the Confucian canon only to lend weight to specific Vietnamese statements about themselves, fragmenting and detaching passages and detaching those passages of their original textual meaning. This complicates, if it does not actually contradict, the notion of a world without translation. In such cases as this, the word meanings are not the problem. It is the meaning of the utterance as a whole that is warped or reversed by the person citing it. Whether this is actually what happened in feudal Vietnam does not concern me. I am concerned to preserve the possibility of its happening, which, it seems to me, requires those Vietnamese readers and writers to hold Chinese texts at a distance, to refuse to nativize them utterly. In order to achieve this irony, abuse, or subversion, they had to be able to handle words provisionally, perhaps cynically, and not assume that their meanings had been settled once and for all. The Hanzi wenhua quan must have been a loose enough linguistic system to allow for that to happen. Do we call that possibility of difference translation, rhetoric, or pragmatics? Translation is certainly one name for the opening of a gap between what is said and what is meant, without which there is no rhetoric, no real dialogue, and no subjectivity. We have seen that the model of kundoku as non-translation, as pure reading, does not really apply to all the variants of vernacular reception of Chinese texts in the regions of and around China. Perhaps the world without translation is really a fantasy of centralization, of identity without difference. If that is so, then Denica's liberation from the Greco-Roman world comes at a higher price, higher, at any rate, than the Vietnamese, according to Wolters, were willing to pay. I would prefer to follow Dagmar Schaefer's recommendation that, I quote, sophisticated regional histories of languages enrich historical understandings of translation practices and ways of coping with a multilingual world. We can infer from such examples an expanded understanding of language interaction and that actors made significant methodological choices when they translated. Thus far, Schaefer. Now, Schaefer's use of terms, let's see if we can get a slide up there. Yeah, there we go. Schaefer's use of terms such as actors and choice remind us that translation is always undertaken for some reason, to achieve some aim, and the reasons and aims can differ greatly among cases. It is always worthwhile to distinguish between what a technology makes possible and what it is actually used to do. Kornitsky again, I quote, translation in pre-modern East Asia was mostly anonymous and one way. Mostly anonymous and mostly one way. No vernacular works produced in any East Asian society were translated into Sinitic or vernacular Chinese and introduced to Chinese readers. This reflects, on the one hand, the literary self-sufficiency of China, but it also shows that the language communities of East Asia were, on the whole, uninterested in cultural exports. Kornitsky cites Cui Hengui, or Cui Xingui, in the 10th century, complaining that Chinese do not read poems by Koreans. On the other hand, it was possible, in another story told by Kornitsky, for two diplomats, one Korean and one Vietnamese, meeting in Beijing to exchange poems in literary Chinese, each praising his own homeland as the place where the codes of ritual and music were followed most scrupulously. It is for a moment as if the stage had been yielded to these cultural inheritors, as if China itself had been transcended. The formula of the Hanzi wenhua quan, this zone where translation is not necessary, applies more or less smoothly only to one part of the wider world immediately affected by Chinese culture. It is actually a monocultural model restricted to certain classes of people in certain areas, and mainly a model for the diffusion outwards of Chinese ways. Even in Korea, Japan, and Vietnam, the good students of Chinese classicism, a great deal of culture, and not only popular culture, took place outside the sphere of Chinese character communication. We should not ignore the communicative traffic on the borders of China that involves demonstrably foreign languages and writing systems. Depending on the era, we might be enumerating the Sogdian and Khitan areas, Manchuria, Mongolia, the Uyghur Caliphates, the Tangut Empire, Tibet, all areas touched by writing systems derived from India, as in Tibet, or from Aramaic, like Old Uyghur, Mongol, and the Manchu script devised in the 17th century. Indeed, the Chinese written language had only recently arrived in large parts of Ming Dynasty China, not to mention the expansions of the Qing. To take the putative Hanzi wenhua quan as the preeminent pattern for the diffusion of Chinese culture is to ignore a large part, and indeed the most challenging and therefore the most interesting part of the story of Chinese multiculturalism. One-way translation, as Kornitsky calls it, describes the diffusion of the most influential texts in Chinese. The books studied by administrators and examination candidates, the literary classics and the Buddhist Tripitaka. They flowed out of China and were often promulgated by states eager to educate, that is, Confucianize and Sinicize their populations. Not much flowed back in the other direction. There was little demand in China for works written abroad. But if we suppose, as is natural for people living in a commercial society to do, that the ideal was to achieve the widest possible distribution for Chinese cultural products, we will fail to capture the thinking of the officials in charge of international relations. Consider this episode from the shared history of Tibet and China. In the tradition of marriage diplomacy, Heqin, Chinese princesses had on occasion been married to the rulers of Tibet. In the year 730, the Jincheng princess sent a message to the Tang court requesting copies of the Shijing, the Zuozhuan, the Liji, and the wenhua, fundamental texts for any literate person, and the princess was obviously a literate person. The secretariat was about to send the books, but an official named Yu Xiulie quickly sent in a memorial urging the contrary. So here you have the text of the memorial. Did I include a translation or not? Let's see. No. All right, I will give you orally then the English translation. We cannot allow ourselves to fail to anticipate the designs of the Zhong. The classics contain our permanent institutions and cannot be lent out to others. Formerly, the Prince of Dongping petitioned to have a personal copy of the Shiji and the philosophical masters, but the Han Emperor would not allow it. The Shiji is full of military plans and the philosophers are full of sophistical arguments. So if the Prince of Dongping, who was a son of the Emperor, was not allowed to possess books of strategy, today the bandits ruling this country of the Rong are our enemies. How is it even imagined to let them have our classics? I have heard concerning the character of these Tibetans that they are decisive and sharp-witted, love to learn, and do not fall back once they have made an advance. If they should acquire our books, they will certainly use the information in them against us. If they become expert in the book of poetry, they will learn about the stalwart defenders who are mentioned in Ode number 7. If they become expert in the records of ritual, they will learn our schedule for mustering and dismissing soldiers. If they become expert in the Zuozhuan, they will learn tricks and feints for winning battles. If they become expert in the wenhua, they will learn to write dispatches and orders. Why should we offer weapons to robbers and give sustenance to bandits? Now this princess, having married an inferior, must obey this husband of hers. She is living in an alien country and is required to follow their outlandish rituals. I suspect that this plan to get useful books from China is not her doing. Rather, by some expedient, they are seeking information from China. If your majesty judges that making such a gift is necessary in order to maintain good relations with the foreigners and preserve trust in our dynasty, I beg you at any rate to leave out the Spring and Autumn Chronicles. The decay of the Zhou institutions, the rise of powerful princes, the anarchy of rights in music, the uninterrupted succession of wars, and the consequent emergence of lying and trickery, such that vassals gave orders to sovereigns and rulers vied for the title of hegemon. If you let them have the book containing these things, it will be a disaster for our dynasty. All right, so there's the memorial of Yu Xiulie, which I simply couldn't resist translating at length. As we see, in this case, not even a fully competent Chinese reader was to be allowed the privilege of reading the classics from a residence abroad. The problem is not one of translation, but of application. Putting the stratagems and precedents of Chinese history in enemy hands would be a huge security leak. And to let foreigners see the Spring and Autumn Chronicles, that record of a time when good order had decayed, princes made constant war on one another, and deception reigned, if letting outsiders see this immense record of dirty laundry from the past might bring a loss of national prestige, which is bad enough, in the worst case, it is as if letting the Tibetans read the Spring and Autumn Chronicles would bring back the history told in those chronicles. Keeping those crucial books within the borders was a matter of information supremacy. Possessing wen in this account is not a vague, mystical, or ethical thing. It is having the books that support a certain way of life. Who should have those books is therefore a sensitive matter. The Jincheng princess may have possessed wen in her individual capacity, but being the wife of an alien, she was in the position of the barbarized Chinese raised as a problem by the Zhou commentators, whom I mentioned last time, right? Where it says, 诸夏有及夷离者，即夷之也. If people of Xia descent were to perform barbarian rituals, that would barbarize them. Right? Exactly the position of the unfortunate princes. Thus, Yu Xiulie's resistance to book exports. Those books made all the difference between the Hua and the Yi. You see that Yu Xiulie is quick to recognize the inborn ability of the Tibetans. He by no means thinks of them as a lesser breed of human. They are quick learners and tenacious thinkers. If we imagine that wide circulation confirms cultural prestige, that is not always the case. Here, it is rather exclusive possession that demonstrates the power of these cultural goods. They are shown to be of a cultural, not ethnic nature by the fact that they can be acquired by anybody, Huaxia or not, and that is why the regulator is anxious that they be politically restricted. On several other occasions in Chinese history, the court intervened to forbid the export of canonical books. Under the Han, as Yu Xiulie's memorial recounts, the Prince of Dongping was not permitted to have the Shiji, though this was more to do with his bad behavior than with any foreignness. Su Shi argued against letting Koreans and Khitans have Chinese books. Here's the reference in case you want to follow up. It's a fun text. On several occasions in the Ming and Qing, foreign missions were forbidden to take books home, particularly maps and geographical works. Something like a technology export license regime surrounded the key works of Chinese culture for many centuries. On the other hand, Buddhist books were never restricted. Religion was not a primary concern of the state, and the teachings were supposed to be universal anyway. In the case of the classics and histories, language and translation are not the problem at all. It is taken for granted that the foreigners can read and understand Chinese. Rather, a social barrier was imposed to make the circulation of information asymmetrical. Thus, the sphere of Chinese character cultures, the wenhua quan, which might look like an intellectual free trade zone, is by no means a space of unrestricted communication. Differences abound, though translation may not be quite the word for the means of negotiating them. The pre-modern Chinese character space is carved up into zones of differential access, prestige, and attention, marked by one-way and two-way flows of information, filtered, layered, and channeled. I believe I even have a graph about this. Nope, that was not the graph. Charting these flows is partly a matter for literary historians. partly a matter of geography and largely a matter of policy. For this is the kind of document we mainly see, debates about policy referring to prior ideology. With cultural diffusion, the terms of the long consecrated distinction between hua and yi are somewhat altered. In debates like that surrounding the Tibetan book export proposal, we can identify three shades of opinion. There are A, those who refuse humanity to the aliens, B, those who think they can be civilized, and C, those who fear they may be civilized. Behind these three options stands a major difference in opinion: whether the hua-yi distinction should be strongly or weakly maintained. Those who think there should be a strong distinction tend to believe that there already is a deep essential difference. Those who think there need not be such a strong distinction are willing to overlook differences or treat them as merely superficial. In fact, there's a very copious literature on this question, which I'll talk about next time. Princess Jincheng's predicament was a familiar one in Chinese poetry. An experience of the borderlands by someone whose strongest ties were with the center. Literary history meets geography on the frontier. The literary frontiers each have their own individuality. Each has its modes of writing and sensibility. Let us return briefly to the musical map of China offered in the Zhou Li. So you've got the center and the four directions here. Departing from the center in any direction, we will encounter one of four boundaries. On the east, the Dongyi. By the Tang Dynasty, Dongyi is only a name found in old books. Their language and ethnic distinctiveness have vanished. Occasionally, the old name is reused to label Korean and Japanese people. But as they have accepted the Chinese character as the vehicle of their high culture, communication with them is relatively smooth. Toward the south, the Nanman are experiencing the push of settlers, armies, refugees, and administrators. Vietnam conserves its Chinese character heritage, similar to the east. The Tang still saw the south, from Guangxi to Fujian, as remote and exotic. Non-Chinese languages there were largely replaced by Chinese dialects over the centuries, and the speakers of indigenous languages were pushed into isolation. Though Hanyu, Liu Zongyuan, and Su Shi endured exile there, this border zone, like the eastern frontier, does not leave a conspicuous trace in literary writing before the Ming. But the north and west frontiers, where Chinese contend with nomads, merchants, and rival empires, are zones of intense literary creation. Music, as I've already indicated, flows across this border and finds a home in Chinese courts and taverns. Music from Goguryeo, India, Bukhara, Kucha, I'm interrupted in mid-list here, Kashgar, Karahuja, the Xianbei and Xiongnu peoples, among others. Poetic genres and topics specific to the north arise. Where the greatest friction between languages and cultures occurs, and where the greatest literary legacy is made out of this friction, is to the north and west, the frontier shared with Xiongnu, Mongol, Manchu, Xianbei, Uyghur, Turkic, Tibetan, Jurchen, Khitan, and other peoples, depending on the era. I am sorry to offer catalogs, but the multiplicity and diversity of the Northwest are inseparable from this literary mode. There are the complaints of women held captive by or bartered in marriage to a northern chieftain, and songs of soldiers sent to guard the northern frontier, marking years and decades of service under the threat of never returning home, just to mention two categories of poem that are extremely well represented in the great Yuefu collection of Guo Maoqian. The 18 songs to a nomad flute, Hujia Shibapai, commemorating Cai Yan and the legend of Wang Zhaojun, are two themes spun into endless variations, dramatizing the difference of Han and Hu. Hundreds of Sai Shang Qu and the like populate the Quan Tang Shi. Drinking songs, songs of farewell, songs describing landscape, weather, customs, women, food, but I'm cataloging again. Though these poems certainly reflect encounters with alien peoples, the typical frontier poem is spoken in the voice of a Chinese addressing other Chinese about the frontier. Once in a while, it adopts the voice of a non-Chinese through the kind of fictive vocalization that Yuefu permitted. 我是陆家儿，不解汉儿歌. I am a son of northern barbarians. I don't know any Han songs, says the speaker of one Zhe Yangliu series, though the point may be to refer to the music, now lost, that was original to the song, rather than disclaiming ability to speak the language. In the North and West, the lands traditionally ascribed to the Di and Rong, the Chinese character cultural sphere encounters a real other. This other either doesn't write at all or writes in an outlandish alphabet. The others cannot represent themselves in Chinese, they must therefore be represented. I'm permitting myself to parody Karl Marx here a little bit. We already saw that when this other speaks and reads Chinese, the available frames of reference make that linguistic competence a symptom of either submission or subversion. Think of the Bailang on the one hand, and on the other, of the Tibetans scheming to get their hands on the Chinese classics. When the foreigner gets spoken, the ambiguity is resolved, but at the cost of turning the speaker into an object of speech rather than its subject, a situation to which I will turn in more detail in my last lecture about exile poetry. By incorporating Northwestern scenes, people, customs, and situations, the makers of folk songs and the authors of courtly verse were performing a kind of cultural transfer, bringing news from the border regions back to the center. As Tsai Yan, or someone impersonating her, says in concluding the Hujia Shiba Pai, Hujia benzi chu huzhong, Lü qin fan chu yin lü tong. 18拍戏曲虽中，享有余兮，思无穷. The nomad flute comes from among the Hu. I have translated or transposed its tunes to the green-strung zither, using the same notes and modes. Although my song of 18 verses is now finished, its resonance lingers, and the thought it expresses will never come to an end. Well, here is an act of representation, analogous to the transliteration and translation from alien tongues that we have been discussing. But is it only an analogy? To make the analogy somewhat more persuasive, something more than a mere metaphor, we would need to catalog the tropes, the techniques, the thematic vocabulary of this frontier literature, this 边陲文学, describing it as seriously as possible as a distinct language within the wider Chinese poetic language. Oops. We'll go back here. But how is it made distinct? Imitation of the lyrics that accompanied foreign music doubtless played a role in stimulating the emergence of frontier poetry as a distinct genre. As Timothy Waigongchan has noted, the evocative power of place names, themselves often clusters of foreign sounds, signals the presence of the frontier in poetry. I cannot actually perform this analysis here, only wave in the direction of its desirability, but I surmise that the creation of a specific subtype of poetry and the rise in popularity of models for composing it annexed the Northwest to the Chinese poetic universe to such a degree that a poet did not need ever to have trod the soil of that region or encountered any of its natives to turn out effective examples of the genre. The canonical frontier poems of Wang Changling and Li Bai, residents of the capital who never served on the frontier, demonstrate this autonomy of poetic convention from experience. I take that to be the indication that a language has, to all intents and purposes, taken the place of a purported reality. The Northwest has been translated inward, 一乎为秦, as Dao An might say, and become a set of protocols available to any competent poet. I've been talking about the verbal naturalization of the Northwest through lyric, always the dominant literary genre, and through historiography, specifically the memoirs on alien populations, the Si Yi Zhi, that are our main source of information on the peoples of the border regions. Poetry and history intersect. Historiography fed the authors of both poems and policy documents by providing material for allusion. Anecdotes, examples, names, and places. A Chinese literary imagination of the Northwest, framed by history writing and lyric poetry, seems almost to point to a space where history would be written as poetry and poems would be received as history. a space that in other cultures is filled by epic. And indeed, the modern Chinese term for epic is 史诗, the history poem. But one of the old chestnuts of literary historiography, pulled out and chewed over every generation or two, is that the Chinese have no national epic, right? A judgment that I am quoting, not endorsing. What does it mean to say that a culture lacks something? What if the people in that culture never felt it as a lack? The Tang Dynasty lacked television, for example, though it would be foolish to claim too much significance for that lack. That's why we now have the Xin Tangchao Dianshi, right? To patch up that missing ingredient. By pointing to the missing epic in China's literary cupboard, Hegel and others, including Hu Shi, asserted a deficiency, as if every self-respecting culture had to have an epic, and as if the absence of one could serve as a diagnosis of some deep flaw in Chinese consciousness. It would be meaningful to say that China lacked an epic only if there was reason to believe that circumstances would have permitted China to have one, or to want one otherwise. The fact that I lack a television, that's true by the way, tells you something about me, permits you to diagnose me as a snob or an eccentric, only because so many people in our age do have them. You may judge that I am missing out. But if I don't want one, my lack doesn't appear as a lack to me. Has anyone shown that pre-modern China might, could, or ought to have had epics? Has anyone shown that any Chinese wanted one before the modern era made it seem that epics were essential equipment for developing a national identity? Though the Chinese literary methods for representing the Northwest, lyric and historiography, can be triangulated to locate the site of an epic, the actual place of epics is on either side of the northwestern border. Basically, the green and purple areas in this map here. Epic traditions centering on a hero who unites disparate tribes, defeats enemies, and founds a conquering dynasty are the dominant verbal art form over a vast range of territory that is today technically within China, but not culturally Chinese. I am forced by the nature of the documentation to talk about recent periods, but it is not unreasonable to suppose that epic composition has been going on for many centuries in Central Asia, Tibet, and the steppes. The Kyrgyz epic of Manas, the Uyghur epic of Oghuz Khan, and the epic of Jangar sung by Mongolians, Kalmyks, and Oirats are all military hero epics. But the largest share of scholarly attention has gone to the Gesar epic of Tibet. The epic of King Gesar of Ling, which according to its translator, Robin Kornman, is, I quote, generally accepted as the longest single piece of literature currently in the world canon, encompassing some 120 volumes and about 20 million words. Thus far, Kornman. This is not necessarily a recommendation in my view. I like a shorter book myself. This epic appears to have arisen in the 13th or 14th century. It circulates in Mongolian, Manchu, Turkic, Tangut, Ladakh, and other versions, though the Tibetan versions are considered primary. The Gesar epic was supported by the institutions of Lamaist Buddhism, the state religion of the Yuan and Qing dynasties, and thus benefited from imperial patronage, however indirect. Printed editions were sponsored in the 19th century by learned Lamaist clergy, most notably the influential Jamgun Ju Mipam. It recounts the birth, ordeals, and military campaigns of King Gesar of Ling, who in the epic overcomes adversaries at home, wins a wife, resists the charms of a number of witch princesses, conquers 18 strategic castles, and subdues the kingdoms of the four quarters to install a realm of peace and justice. Warrior epic, trickster fables, anecdotes of skill, tales of magic, and acts of spiritual combat combined with events from the history of eastern Tibet in the 12th century. The non-Tibetan Gesars naturally vary in the episodes included, but are recognized as being versions of the same story. The divinified Gesar is honored in temples throughout Tibet, Central Asia, Manchuria, and Mongolia. And let me take a moment to thank Ting Krao for supplying information about this enormous tradition about which I have very little direct information. In terms of literary geography, then, the vast and populous land of China, which allegedly lacks an epic, is thus surrounded by epics on three sides. Tibetan, Central Asian, and Mongolian Manchurian epics are couched in different languages and may celebrate different heroes, but otherwise show a remarkable similarity in their themes and performance styles. The epic in full flower was right next door to China, and China was ruled for centuries by people who indulged in epic. The Yuan or Mongol dynasty from 1276 to 1368, the Qing or Manchu dynasty from 1644 to 1911. But Chinese literati were having none of it. Literary values in China, it seems, implied not a failure to compose epic, but an actual rejection of it. Indeed, acquaintance with epic tradition is a marker of the degree to which the non-Chinese and the Chinese Empire shared cultural resources in which the Chinese took no interest. When the Panchen Lama visited Beijing in 1780, his conversation with the Manchu Qianlong Emperor concerned the factual basis of the Gesar. The Lama prepared for this interview by gathering information from a learned colleague. Epic, like Tibetan Buddhism, provided a kind of cultural glue for uniting the inner-Asian peoples of the Manchu Imperium, but no one ever tried to make it appeal to the Chinese. Gesar, the Jangar epic, and the epic of Oguz Khan were never translated into Chinese until the late 20th century. The Manchus knew the low regard Chinese had for steppe peoples and nomads, the very people among whom epic has traditionally flourished, and did not seek to spread Manchurian cultural practices among the people they ruled. The origins of the Gesar, Jangar, and Manas epics are multiple. They arose in a variety of milieus that encouraged cultural mixing. The Pan-Asian migrations of Mongol armies, the wanderings of Turkic peoples, the commercial oases of the Silk Road, and the passages between India, Tibet, and Central Asia. One of the formative influences on the Gesar epic was the Ramayana, available in a condensed Tibetan version from at least the 11th century. Among the components of the Gesar are, and here I'm going to quote Rolf Stein at some length, the components include, first, the cycle of the four sons of heaven, doubled by the cycle of the Lokapalas, or the guardians of the four directions. For reasons of religious folklore, the representatives of the north, Gesar and Vaisravana, got special emphasis in this cycle. Then came the cycle of the northern hidden realm, Shambhala, and the Ramayana epic. Finally, the epic of the tribulations of Pehar, the Alexander romance, the Sogdian tale of Kisar and the bandits, Indian legends of the Chakravartin, or divine king, and the wonder-working horse, and still others. This is a characteristically Central Asian mix of foreign themes transported by Buddhist missionaries, Sogdian merchants, Muslim travelers, obscure marketplace singers, and other vagabonds, combined with and superimposed on indigenous Tibetan stories, particularly those from the Amdo region. So I'm getting all that information from Rolf Stein's wonderful book, Recherches sur l'épopée et le barde au Tibet, from 1959. Still unsurpassed in this area. An oral epic accumulates and digests any material that is seen as valuable for developing its themes. Ironically, in light of the history of epics being claimed as the foundation legends of national uniqueness, oral epics are extremes of hybridity in the Asian area, and Asian nomad epics are particularly so. A copy of the Mongol text of the Gesar was printed and stored in the Imperial Qing Library in 1716. The Chinese label on the outside attests to what seems like a misunderstanding. Sanguo Yanyi, the Romance of the Three Kingdoms, it reads. This is a bit like mistaking Goethe's Faust for the Iliad because Helen of Troy appears in both. There is, however, a connection. And this makes me think that the apparent misunderstanding is actually a bit of crafty cultural policy. One of the heroes of the Romance of the Three Kingdoms is Guan Yu, later deified under the name of Guandi. Temples dedicated to Gesar in the Tibetan, Central Asian, and North Asian areas were known to Chinese-speaking settlers as temples of Guandi. anyone who took a good look at the legends, paintings, or statues concerning Gesar would come to understand that here was a different hero. Here is a different hero, a Buddhist wonder-working warrior king whose efforts at uniting 3 Tibetan kingdoms came 1,000 years after the division of China into the 3 kingdoms fought over by Guan Yu and his rivals. However, equating Gesar with Guandi is a comparison just good enough to do what it was meant to do, namely to draw a parallel between heroes of the Chinese and Tibetan communities in just the way that served Manchu cultural policy. This illustration shows the Guan Yu temple that was built in Lhasa by the Qianlong emperor after he had sent his troops in to put down some rebellious Nepalese who were invading Lhasa. Right? So it's definitely a Chinese temple within the Tibetan area. There we go. There's that. Let's see. Okay, here, let me go back. Yep. I thought I had a picture of the statues inside. Inside this temple, you have Gesar and Guandi sitting right next to each other as if they're sharing a cup of tea. However, equating Gesar with Guandi is a comparison just good enough to do what it was meant to do, namely to draw a parallel between heroes of the Chinese and Tibetan communities in just the way that served Manchu cultural policy. Since the epic is already such a hybrid, isn't it a continuation of previous practice to invite Guandi to join the parade? In 2003, the Gesar epic was added to UNESCO's list of items of intangible cultural heritage, and the Chinese government laid out a 9-year action plan for archiving recitations, training young performers, and building performance venues across Tibet, Central Asia, and Inner Mongolia. It may be that by endowing these national minorities' heroic tales with an infrastructure, the modern Chinese state, wrestling with its multicultural and multi-ethnic makeup, is seeking to diffuse their autonomous potential. After all, the heroes of the Gesar, Jangar, Oghuz Khan, and other epics led their armies against rival groups and conquered their neighbors, including, in some instances, China. One report from the Indian Defense Review, the standpoint of which should be obvious, views the celebration of the nomadic epic tradition as Machiavellian, suggesting that episodes of the Oghuz Khan epic focusing on Chinese treachery are being revised away, and that statements about the relative dating of the Manas and Oghuz Khan epics are to be read not as philological disputes, but as an aspect of the contest between Kyrgyzs and Uyghurs for cultural preeminence in the region. Present-day China has inherited the boundaries set by the Qing emperors, who established a protectorate over Tibet, conquered the Muslim principalities that now make up Xinjiang, and retained their old base in the steppes of Mongolia and Manchuria. But ruling as a centralized state with a 92% Han Chinese majority, China has had to develop cultural policies distinct from the Manchu practice of cultural separateness. Their position on ethnic minorities and national cultural heritage has been developed from the Soviet response to the nationalities question, with input from professional ethnographers. There's a wonderful book by Tom Malini about how the ethnic classifications were developed in the 1950s. The official line is that the People's Republic is a 统一的多民族国家. This formula allows one to play on the 多民族 part or on the 统一 part, depending on the purpose. So now, in his closing speech to the National People's Congress in March 2018, Xi Jinping can claim the Gesar and other epics for China. Let's see. So, longish quote here. I'll just render one sentence or two because it's rather pompous. But Xi Jinping says, "The Chinese people have always been industrious and creative. Our motherland produced Lao Tzu, Confucius, Zhuangzi, and other world-renowned creative thinkers. She inherited the soul-shaking great epics of King Gesar, Manas, and Jangar." And he goes on to inventory many other cultural, architectural, and other monuments of China. Now, indeed, the repackaging of these epics as part of Chinese cultural inheritance, despite the fact that the Chinese were never interested in them before, serves political ends, however much it departs from the epic's history, language, and content. In the official Ruist imagination of geography and culture, wild and barbaric peoples are drawn to the central regions in search of the civilizing benefits of rights, music, and governance. That cultural goods could come from outside the Chinese domain was unthinkable. Even when China was ruled by barbarian dynasties, the realm of culture was, at least in theory, an undiluted heritage of the Chinese sages. Now the Chinese inheritance of these epics makes them another venue for the One Belt, One Road initiative. I do not like to claim that national character never changes, but the repetition of an old scenario strikes me as an instance of cultural inertia. In my next lecture, The Formation of China, Asymmetries in the Writing of History, I'll talk more about the problems posed by nationalizing cultural property and identity. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you so much, Haun. This was a very rich and very insightful talk. Starting with this your subtle critique of Wiebke Denneke's claim about the world without translation, and then going on and you mentioned a lot of different texts and emphasizing difference and not identity, and this continuous eternal struggle between wild people at the borders and the civilized Chinese people in the at court or in the central regions, and I found this very interesting, and I am very much looking forward to the discussion. I had somehow to think of I was reminded of my first lessons of classical Chinese in Heidelberg when we were already talking about Wang Zhaojun and so these famous stories. So I'm now very happy to introduce the respondent to your talk, which I think is an excellent choice. So we're very happy and very honored to have Dinu LUCA with us here. Who is Dinu LUCA? Dinu is a professor of European cultures at National Taiwan Normal University, and he's a real sinologist, a real historian, and he has worked published broadly on various topics relating to the Chinese language and to Chinese culture, and in particular, you have published about the European fascination with Chinese language. So you have just published a book called The Chinese Language in European Texts, the Early Period, with Paragraph Macmillan in 2016. And Haun wrote a very beautiful review, a very positive review about this. So I think you two have a lot in common there, and a lot to exchange. So I'm looking forward to your comments. Thank you.
With bursts of strange translated music. That's how I would answer when asked with what Haun's previous talk in the series captivated us last Thursday. By giving such an answer, I would not be using my own words, hence my smile to Haun, but rather with a tiny modification, Haun's own. Indeed, it is with this particular sequence that translation as citation, Haun's 2017 text, ends. I cite it here at the beginning of my remarks about today's lecture for two reasons. First, I would like to emphasize how much what we are learning these days at Haun's Zhengda conferences enters into dialogue with and echoes and develops into new polyphony the piping of his 2017 work. There is continuity here, just like there is much novelty. Just read the book if you haven't done so already. And Zhuangzi's student, out Zhuangzi, and Matteo Ricci, the eccentric Taoist, and Xu Zhimo's exquisite Baudelarian stenches, read the book, will appear to have been themselves very much part of today's conversation on borderlands and margins. I also start by quoting Haun on music, because it seems important to me to highlight that today's talk, while a fully independent academic being of its own, is also part of the larger puzzle that is being constructed at Zhengda these days. Last week, you will remember, we moved from ninefold translation to singing barbarians. And today, as the third relay in Haun's exploration of the 9 relays, the Yue Bodeman's performance and the Bailang Pean to Han virtue have given place to others and to other practices. Script has replaced song, and Haun has taken us to a new realm, the Hanzi wenhua quan, that is, within and without and next to the Chinese character cultural sphere. Now, Haun being Haun, and you remember that he lacks a television, so we may expect anything from this man, and the 9 relays mentioned above being shorthand for literary communication across pre-modern Asia, he would, of course, not let us stay comfortably at the center of this sphere. In fact, he would not allow us any centrality or centrism whatsoever, today, like always. Instead, he would have us visit, again, today like always, peripheries, marshlands, frontiers, borderlands. To put it otherwise, we have been offered the within, but not without its without. The outside in, and, as the subtitle of translation as citation would have it, the inside out. On this extremely stimulating dynamics, now several clumsy and highly selective glosses. The first part of today's talk has been dedicated to the examination of a series of statements made by a number of scholars, as pointed out by Kai a few seconds ago, primarily Denneke and Kornitsky, on the practice of vernacular reading. Some of Denneke's statements are particularly strong, those on the existence of a world without translation in East Asia, or on translation being, I quote, indispensable only with phonetic scripts. And they linger long in the mind. It appears to me that they also reveal, as a quick look at her 2014 work shows, a type of scriptolatry, or perhaps Hanzi-latry, if I can construct this, that builds itself much in response to similarly strong and sometimes infelicitous pronunciations by the likes of John DeFrancis or James Unger, while also echoing, perhaps unwittingly, the intensity of sinological debate centered on Chinese characters in the 1940s and the 1990s. Haun shows how Denneke, I quote, simplifies by excluding both a lot of cultural variability and the many historical processes and practices through which reading methods come to be. And he adduces several fascinating examples to make his point. One such case regards the secret history of the Mongols and its use of Chinese characters for their phonetic value, and we remember the slide shown a few minutes ago. And seeing the modern Chinese edition with sound versus sound and meaning in parallel columns must create at least some initial moments of disoriented wonder. All such scriptural contexts strengthen Haun's points on the significance of difference. And one can have in mind here everything from the common but not less exciting cases of multi-script one finds in everyday life, Hanzi plus Japanese kana plus popomo plus Latin letters in ads in the streets, to the marvelously strange pages of the Chinese rendition of Finnegan's Wake from a few years ago, that feature, next to Chinese and Latin alphabet text and countless symbols, conventions, footnotes, and the likes, characters that the translation herself produced specifically to render Joyce's own impossible manufactures. One can add to this list even the German language in Chinese script, a 2013 work on Sino-European cognates, produced by a self-confessed devotee of abstract art and skateboarding, which retails on Amazon for $900 and is also available for free on academia.edu. But here we have, I think, more disorientation than wonder. Now, on a more serious note, Haun's subsequent observation on the improbability of scriptural competence being acquired without reliance on sound reminds one of how such a feat has been quite literally the stuff of legends. Examples of the more modern type would include, for instance, Pound's reminiscence about his friend Gaudier Brzeska's uncanny abilities with Chinese characters. In the more traditional variety, we have had geographical accounts that have the Dominican father Miguel de Benavides successfully demonstrate in dire circumstances on the Fujian coast in the 1580s extreme scriptural competence miraculously attained by sight only with the assistance of a mysterious, silent, and no doubt divine stranger. This would be perhaps interesting to compare with potentially related episodes of expertise in vernacular reading, should they exist at all. In fact, was kundoku competence supposed to derive somehow naturally, like a kind of property or function of characters, perhaps? And then, would the illustration provided by Kornitsky visually showing how the addition of a few graphic signs Japans or Japanizes the first line of the analects leave any room for proficiency-related judgments like, I'm better at kundoku than you? How about Galambosch's educated Tangut individuals? Is there any lore regarding their Chinese literary culture skills? And if Pound Benavides type pious accounts are missing, how about closely allied anecdotes satirizing less successful brush talk encounters of the kind Denneke also mentions, like those, for instance, French newspapers delighted in spreading about the first face-to-face meeting between Abel Rémusat, Europe's premier sinologist of the 1820s, and native Chinese speakers. Let me, however, go back to the lecture. In his next move, Haun accepts Kornitsky's understanding of kundoku as bound translation, while adding further nuance on the kind of disciplining of the other perceived by dissident scholars like Ogyu Sorai behind vernacular reading. Claims of foreigners enable a kind of critique, Haun continues, leading to the possibility of things staying distant and meanings remaining unsettled. I quote, "Do we call that possibility of difference translation, rhetoric, or pragmatics? Translation is certainly one name for the opening of a gap between what is said and what is meant, without which there is no rhetoric, no real dialogue, and no subjectivity." This is vintage Saussy, one would say. Just as much as when he states next that world without translation is really a fantasy of centralization, of identity without difference. And fantasy it is, of course, I think, not only because it claims too much, but also because it glosses over too much. Let us only remember, and just in passing, the old passage from the Guoyu, introducing us to the Zhou officers known as the Shiren, or Tang people, or the Xiangxu officials, Martha Chong's likeness renderers, or Wolfgang Baer's representation discriminators, and the many duties that the Zhou lists for them, or the 4 different names for the protocols of translation that the Li Ji defines in a well-known context. Quite a linguistic waste for translatorial dearth, one would say. And it remains a fantasy, I believe, even when we move to more modern barbarians. I remember with Eva Hong, the sheer number and qualities of local and foreign translators mediating the rise of Buddhism in China or later Ming interactions, or with Dagmar Schäfer, quoted by Haun, the importance of understanding matters in terms of actors, communities, and choices. As for the potential costs of identity without difference, we need not go too far. Well, we can go just to the end of the paper, but I'll get back to that. Even if the context may seem radically different from that of the kundoku practice, the story of the early Portuguese embassy of Tome Pires to Ming China, resulting in doors remaining closed, and a string of punishments uniting in death translators and ambassador alike, all motivated by not allowing the gap of translation to function, is gruesome enough to warn us about uniformities of all kind. Haun's conclusion to the first part of his talk does not take us to such ghastly realms and opens rather than closes doors. Indeed, when stating that, I quote, "to take the putative Hanzi wenhua quan as the preeminent pattern for the diffusion of Chinese culture is to ignore a large part, and indeed the most challenging and therefore the most interesting part of the story of Chinese multiculturalism, this is an invitation, just like the whole series of talks, to reconsider centrality and periphery and revisit borderlands and their very status. This is when we learn about the story of the Qingcheng princess and the control of cultural flaws that Yu Xulie argues for, keeping the classics, histories, the Wenxuan, and mostly the dirty laundry of the Chunqiu away from the prying eyes of the other, a very keen and inquisitive other, much too eager to learn and out-one the legitimate one producers and guardians. Behind the policy meant to secure the preservation of information supremacy lie, of course, countless center-centered assumptions, some of which already popped up in Haun's previous 2 talks. One of these, and the most fundamental one perhaps, is certainly that it was taken for granted that the foreigners can read and understand Chinese. From here, again, the mind starts roaming freely, a bit too freely, as you will notice by listening to the next 2 paragraphs. There is first the Yongzheng Emperor's Edict of 1727 asking rhetorically, how can the teachings of China be ever implemented in the West? Then the beheading, the first documented beheading of a translator for teaching Chinese to foreigners in 1760. Then, and going a bit earlier, the 1721 and the 1724 decrees by the same Yongzheng Emperor, followed by the later Canton system regulations, clearly reiterating the ban against Chinese learning imposed on Westerners. How would, one wonders, Yu Xulie or the Prince of Tongping have related or reacted to all this? Every time when doors were meant to be open, to be closed, or to be left ajar, it seems to me there's a story to tell. And since we are here and Haun is known to like words like askance and askew, read translation as citation, may I suggest an exploration of ajar as well? Back and moving to Europe, there is Alessandro Valignano and his concerted efforts at airbrushing the religious situation of Europe for the benefit of Japanese audiences and control dirty laundry issues in Rome's own backyard, the thriving of the Protestant Reformation in 16th century Europe. A while later, there's Leibniz and his putative fear of Chinese missionaries spreading to Europe their culture. Was this going to be by means of Latin or rather Chinese, one wonders? And in the same vein, how about the occasional odes sung in praise of the Chinese language, both by people who understood it, like Matteo Ricci and Nicolas Trigault, or who did not, like John Webb, but could still imagine it to be the perfect, universal, primitive language of humankind in a strangely twisted but oh so exciting 17th century European version of the Hanzi, wenhua, quan. And against all this, of course, version after version at different times and in different contexts of cultural centrism that would proclaim the language of the self as the only possible language, while discreetly allowing or tacitly accepting as counterpoint all sorts of compromise, negotiation, and adaptation. Lest my roaming turn into rambling, if it hasn't done so already, let me relay back to Haun and his point on the abundance of difference within the pre-modern Chinese character space, an area that was, quote, carved up into zones of differential access, prestige, and attention, marked by one-way and two-way flows of information, filtered, layered, and channeled. No other is quite like the other, or like another, Haun reminds us next, by appealing to frontier literature and focusing mostly on the real other from the north and west, a non-scriptural other, or another that is the user of an outlandish alphabet, keeping it illegible, powerful, and in immense need of representation. In a footnote, Haun points out that Edward Said put his emblematic Orientalism under an emblem, a motto, appropriated from Marx with abuse. Said's misrepresentation, whereby 代表 becomes 在线, functions as a superb and superbly ironic pointer to the twisted territories we find ourselves in now, and Haun can argue that with tongue poets, quote, a language has, to all intents and purposes, taken the place of a purported reality, perhaps as part of what we may call, in a bow to Said, a version of North Occidentalism. The outlandish alphabets have not preserved the Northwest, which has now become readily available as a set of protocols, categories, and conventions. Haun can declare it with another, I think, vintage Saussy formulation, to have experienced incorporative inward translation. And there is more to come, because on the frontier, it is not only literary history and geography that meet, it is also poetry and history. Haun's last section is in fact dedicated to the lack in China of the history, poetry, of the 史诗, of the epic. Hegel and others talk of Chinese absence, deficiency, lack of epics here, but we will remember also philosophy and even of what makes a language a true language. Deficient as it is in itself, is also shown to be inaccurate in another sense. Surrounded by epics on three sides, China has simply rejected the epic, which remained a kind of cultural glue uniting borderlands but leaving the center strangely unaffected. Until very recently, perhaps, when incorporative practices seem to be going in a very different direction. Magnificence in creative spirit, we learn from the talk's last extended quote, involves both producing and inheriting, with master craftsmen of thought like Zhuangzi rubbing shoulders with the Manas epic and for good measure with the Potala Palace. There is no place here for cherishing men from afar, to echo the title of a famous book, because there seems to be little room left for afar in this homogeneous space of identity without difference. From all this, the significant problems associated with the Chinese character cultural sphere should emerge quite clearly. Also, that Haun's next relay should concern matters related to nationalizing cultural property and identity should come as no surprise. This, in fact, brings me back to where I started and helps me close my own quan this evening. To recap, tonight's talk has shown us Haun in one of his favorite locations, exploring borderlands and the many kinds of exchanges, lawless, unruly, unpredictable, but so rich, taking place therein. It is also part of a series growing under our own eyes, a third link in a longer chain, seamlessly uniting singing barbarians with asymmetries in the writing of world history, and ninefold translation with the edge of the world. In my remarks, I have mostly tried to think along Haun here and there also attempting to think with him. Regardless of how well I have succeeded, in tonight's leg of Haun's relay race, it is now time for me to pass the baton to all of you, not before thanking Haun again for the intellectual stimulation he has provided us with at Junta this December. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. It was a wonderful response. I think
Yeah.
you want to respond immediately?
Just with gratitude. It's wonderful to be read, with detail and with a synthesizing imagination that sees the connections among the pieces that might even have escaped the person who thought he was writing the text. So that's splendid. Is that one live? Yeah. Good. Okay. All right, but no piece of writing is ever complete. It always needs audiences to respond to it and correct it and add in the missing pieces. So I would love to hear some comments if anyone has questions.
Thank you for such a wide-ranging talk, covering a multitude of subjects. Even so, I felt that in some respects, the discussion had a kind of restrained feel to it. And what I mean by that, let's take an example, which is the treatment of epic. I don't think that epic did not get any traction within the Chinese heartland for political reasons, but rather because epic is a form which relies upon and sits upon a certain social basis. And the social basis in the heartland of China is either not present or is ignored by officialdom because it should not exist in the first place. Now, if you look at Homeric epic, what you find is that, well, actually not very much is known about the original circumstances of performance of Homeric epic, but epic in lots of other places was primarily a recitation at chiefly gatherings, usually in winter during the agricultural slack season, a gathering of the chiefly clan and the other aristocratic and higher level people. And basically they feasted and got very drunk and listened to endless epic stories. And the epic stories, if they had any function, shall we say, religious function at all, it was to recall past deeds in order to call them back up into the present, and thereby energize the then existing social group in all of its endeavors. Now, you had that kind of thing in Tibet. You had that kind of thing in some of the other borderlands in China, but you did not clearly have that kind of thing in the same fashion in the heartland of China at all. And I think that the solution to this is based on the relationship between, shall we say, literary form and social context primarily.
Right. I think that's absolutely true. I think in China, history writing grew up so early that it more or less nipped in the bud the impulse to epic, because of course epic thrives where there aren't factual histories with dates and names and little details. It's all about filling in the spaces of memory with imaginative reconstructions that heroize people, and no one could do that to most of the figures of Chinese history once they'd been written into the what we might call the realistic language, right? The close focus, the very prosaic language of the histories. And I'm far from thinking that that's a bad thing. In fact, part of the glory of Chinese culture is this immense series of histories and the attention that it gives to individual personalities. But they're so individual that they no longer would fit into the kind of mythologizing framework that you get in Homer. So yes, yeah, the idea of chiefly gatherings of what are basically brigands in a well-regulated society, who are just gathering to brag about their deeds or their misdeeds. You don't find space for that in the much more well-ordered and civilized spaces of literate China. Yeah.
我也是要问关于 epic 的问题，在19页提到黑狗跟胡适，我觉得他们两个就不太一样，然后跟您在这里要引用的目的也不太一样。黑狗可能会是说这个他指的应该是像荷马这样子的就是在文明的早期有一个这么庞大的一个作品，然后让你知道什么是 Greekness。那可是到了胡适的话，我想他当然知道西洋那一回事，可是他另外有想到的是，中国文学上面没有这么，就是从文学价值上来说，或是艺术上来说，没有这么好的作品。那这的确是一个这两个不太一样的，但是到您这边的时候，又是好像又变成了是另外一个面对另外一个问题，或是另外一个场景，然后来提的，可不可以请您要不要在这方面再说一下？
是可以。我手上没有那个正文，但是胡适在1919年左右，在一封信里头说，我们在中国需要一个比较的文学，所以他用那个词，当然让我这个教比较文学的人注意到了，所以他说只有一个比较的文学观可以告诉我们为什么中国没有悲剧，为什么没有史诗。那其实这是两项不需要的 category， 但是在胡适当时的想法是文化的演变的自然的产生物，而为什么中国没有，一定是可以指出中国文化的一种缺点或者一种不存在的条件。所以那当然是非常早期的胡适，后来他对这些文类这些 genres 有比较完整的分析跟思想，可以在他的白话文学史里看到很有系统的分析，但是就是正好那个五四运动的气氛就在那儿，就为什么别人有这个东西而我们没有？一定是我们的错，有一点这个样子。所以这个并不代表胡适的整个的 career， 但是就是那个可能受了一点 Hegel 的影响的那个时候的胡适。所以在下一版我一定要找到那篇文字，然后贴上去。谢谢。
Because thank you very much. This was very stimulating. I missed the second talk, so I just I still need to somehow draw together to all the lines or to the dots, and so it's a very broad question probably. But because you just mentioned this problem of individuality, so when you were talking about individual characters, in Homer, I think, So and somehow. We had a talk by Michael Forster over the weekend about this very issue, and Hegel and individuality, and how this kind of Hegel is still shaping our perception of China and cultural otherness. So as somehow lacking individuality, and I think this very issue of the epic there is somehow very crucial. So and comes up again and again. So it might just be an old chestnut, as you said, a kind of literary chestnut. But I have often been struck by this, and I don't know whether maybe the question is meaningless because it's a very broad question. But so how to express individuality in different historical contexts by means of literature is somehow a thing I would like to maybe to push you or to say, maybe to ask you to say more on this. So somehow you don't say much about the Confucian tradition. You just mentioned it once. I think the rule is tradition. So could one say more about this? So to what extent Confucian values allow the expression of individuality, or is this already maybe the wrong question? So, for example, like in calligraphy, people have written tons of books about this, and somehow, for example, Wang Xizhi in particular, has often been described his calligraphy as a very individual, or somehow as a very artistic success, and somehow expressing his individuality. But on the other hand, it's not very visible. So somehow individuality is not. Yeah, it's hidden. I would argue in these cultural practices you have to imitate for a very long time, and ultimately maybe you reach this or you achieve this value of individuality. So, but it's not really visible. It doesn't strike you immediately, like for example in Homer, if you see Achilles or some of these warriors. So maybe this is a wrong comparison, but just came to me. Yeah, I should ask you here.
Yeah, I think if I'm looking for individuality in classical Chinese, one of the places I would go looking for it is in the biographies sections of the histories, right? Sima Qian is wonderful in this. He tells you somebody's life story, and he includes a lot of relatively meaningless detail that allows you to see exactly what that person is made of, right? Not just, what achievements this person had and what the person's reputation was, but for example, when he's being led out to be executed, Li Si says to his son, "Wouldn't you rather be going out to chase the crafty hare with our yellow dogs?" So completely irrelevant to Li Si's whole history, except that it captures him. You get a sense of the man there, and often it's in these moments of extremity that Sima Qian gives you a little glimpse into their private lives, or what you have to call their individual psychology. So when I think about Homeric characters now, the genre of the oral epic imposes a kind of formulaic quality, right? When Achilles comes, he's always swift-footed Achilles, right? Odysseus is always many-minded Odysseus, right? And they're getting onto their black ships as the rosy-fingered dawn comes up, and so on. And this is, of course, part of the production infrastructure, shall we say, of the epic, right? It's the way that you retain it in memory and are able to spin out these stories for hours and hours, always keeping to that dactylic hexameter meter, which is not very easy to chant in Greek. So the formula help you do that, but you almost never have, according to Milman Parry anyway, a formulaic phrase that is singular, right? Every phrase is there because it's useful, and it's repeated because it's useful. And there aren't redundant formulae, right? So it's all about the function. So when I put Homer next to Sima Qian, then the individuality of those biographical anecdotes really jumps out at me. And I find the biography sections of all the histories intensely rewarding to read. I can just pull down any of them. And the people who wrote the dynastic histories were generally doing a rather dull job. The sections on the reigns of the different emperors are uniformly rather dull because they're written to a kind of specification. You have to, of course, they're chronicling the events and so on, but there's much more stereotyped language. When you get into the tales of the different literati or the different officials and what kinds of situations they confronted, there you had these moments where personality jumps out at you. Even with a relatively untalented scribe, as many of these traditional historians were, although, well, these books were always written by committees anyway, right? There's a chief editor affixed to the front of the book. So that's one area where I really see this coming up. And you just have the feeling of kind of living with these people who lived long ago in ways that you wouldn't if you were envisioning them under some kind of official stance or reading their posthumous biographies, the sort of things that are written on a stele. There again, it's much more cut and dried and stereotypical than what you would get in the historical biography. So that's one place where I would look for it, I think. And of course, in many periods too, the value of eccentricity is heightened, right? You know, and it would, you know, I have a sort of a rough sense, which probably everybody here shares, that there's certain periods like, you know, the Six Dynasties and the Ming when eccentrics are valued, and we could probably spin out some theories about why that is, right? Because these are times when the central authoritative values don't have that much appeal, right? When they're sort of lacking in magnetism. No one is inspired by them for various, often similar reasons, right? You know, you have poor government and a lot of tyranny and a lot of unearned privilege, and the people who had previously been working hard for their privilege get dispirited and embittered and decide to go off and live in caves in the mountain and play chess and get drunk and so on. And that's when you have the rise of really singular individuals, right? And you, yeah. Yep. Yeah.
The mainstream Buddhist ideology was rather suspicious of this.
Right, right. And you have the disappointed people too, right? The disappointed people are the ones who can permit themselves to be more eccentric. So in a way, the system of rewards that is held out as the kind of the index of a good society, right? What we call the just world hypothesis in psychology these days, right? People can convince themselves that they live in a decent world because they observe that good people have good things happening to them. That works up until a certain point, and when people see too many good people getting, you know, bad results and suffering for it, they might eventually abandon their just world hypothesis. Well, it's the abandonment of that hypothesis that generates the eccentrics in Chinese history, I think. Yeah.
I have a question myself.
Yeah.
So yeah, actually, it's a question or an observation that I wanted to keep for perhaps the last session, because it's something that I just been paying attention to in this series of lectures. But it's basically this logic of the inscription that you are exploring. So this idea of imposing a foreign form of this wen on a native material, which is this tree. And I think, well, it's very interesting the fact that when you are presenting that and discussing all these questions, we see that despite the violence of this gesture or of this writing as inscription, despite this violence, the inscription very often also escapes to the intended directionality. This is what you and affects to some extent the scribe or the scribers. But the question is that since you have raised the last example of this the Tibetan epic being reappropriated in the context of contemporary nationalist ideology, the question is that this strategy of inscription is also meant to be effective. So despite the fact that it can produce effects that go in the opposite direction, but the strategy itself is meant to be effective. So it's meant to achieve this imposition of the foreign form on the native material. And the question is if we can consider this history of the Chinese literature from the perspective of the borderlands that you are proposing. The question is in today's context, so in the context of today's Hanzi wenhua quan, how do we reconsider the modalities of this inscription? How can we rethink of the inscription? And I understand that actually what you are doing is actually your own project of rewriting this history of Chinese literature is a way of dealing with or addressing this problem. But the problem, my general question is, isn't the inscription system a chronic problem? Isn't perhaps the biggest problem or the biggest difficulty when we try to learn with it. Yeah.
Yes, it's very hard to escape it, right? Because where you have inscription, you always have imposition of a sameness, right, or gathering into a category or of a community, and sometimes the things that are being gathered into that community don't tend to fit in with it, right? So I think the example of the Vietnamese who are in a way reading the Chinese classics with their own local interests at heart and simply using them as pretexts are they're a rather inspiring example, because they're doing something that is absolutely inscription, right? They're repeating the words, but they're just making a different. They're kind of punning, right, on the use of them, and I think it's important to point to pun, because pun is the case where you have a similarity in form but a difference in meaning, as opposed to, say, metaphor, where you have difference in form but similarity in meaning. So playing pun off against metaphor might be one way. I think I see in that a gesture that allows you to admit the power of inscription, but in some way exempt the meanings that you're expressing from the dominance of the inscription itself. And of course, inscription systems are, just by their nature, right, they're powerful. National boundaries are a very fine example of an inscription, right? Everybody knows that they're not given in nature, not even in the case of an island kingdom. They're acts of human will that impose something upon the nature that's given, and it takes an additional piece of human will to draw further distinctions and resist them. So I think in one sense, Xi Jinping in that last quotation is doing something that's perfectly tautologous, right? Tibetans today hold Chinese passports. Therefore, anything that any Tibetan did was done by and for China. Right? It's ludicrous, but in the terms of the kind of inscription of the name of China on every inch of the territory that he's interested in performing, it's perfectly legitimate, right? In those terms only. So the question becomes, how can we recover the memory of moments in history when that imposition on every inch of territory was not the case, right? And of course, it doesn't take a lot of effort. You simply read a work of history that dates from before 1949 and you can find exceptions to it. But that's not available to every person in the Chinese cultural space. And in fact, if you stress too much that difference of boundary, right, the fact that Tibet has not always been entirely a Chinese cultural space, many people will get very angry at you and start calling you names and throwing things at you, which I think is also a form of inscription. So anyway, the point though is to keep alive the sense that there are contentions wherever there are inscriptions, right? That the authoritative move of planting a name on a piece of territory or on a person can't be allowed to be the last word, although we might have to exert some creativity to have it not be the last word.
We have time for a last question.
If you allow me to jump back to the epic question,
Sure.
because of the Sanguo Yanyi connection on page 22, that the King Gesa edition was labeled Sanguo Yanyi. I mean, it is about 3 kingdoms, if I understand correctly. I'm unfortunately not very familiar with the King Gesa epos. But I have been wondering about the Yanyi xiaoshuo and what you said about epic sort of filling the cracks in history, and if there might, I mean, it's not in your definition, epic is very much connected to like the aristocracy and sort of the elite coming to listen to it, which wouldn't probably be the case with Yanyi xiaoshuo. But they have this sort of performative culture attached to it, also with like the proselymetric editions that we have throughout the Ming dynasties. And I've been thinking about this for a while, and also because, as I told you, I researched Fengshen Yanyi, which calls itself a Yanyi, but is not really historical or partially historical, but then it has this large religious material that sort of gets crammed in there and is more the focus of the novel. So I've been wondering if that has been something that you have ever thought about, or because it's been on my mind a lot recently, and I'm still not quite sure how to properly frame this and think about this.
Right. Yeah. Well, Yanyi is used fairly broadly, right? There's a text that I'll be talking about in my next talk called 大学演义部, right? The supplements to the Yanyi of the 大学, and the 大学 is not a narrative text at all. It's a philosophical text, and it's this wildly brilliant and somewhat crazily organized Ming Dynasty statecraft encyclopedia that proceeds by chopping up the text of the Da Xue into little bits and commenting and adding lots and lots of stories and anecdotes to every little piece of it. And it forms a kind of a total encyclopedia of Ming Dynasty policies about everything you can imagine. It's huge. It's in, I think, 160 juan, so it would keep you busy for quite a while. And I find this application of Yanyi, right, as commentary to be very consonant with the traditional understanding of fiction as what happens between the lines of an authoritative account, right? So that's where you get, 拜官野史, right, and the notion that there's an official history, but there are things that are left out, and someone has to go and reconstitute or reimagine those things that are left out. And that opens the space for performance, which indeed could be an oral genre, a public genre, a performance genre. I think of all those tea house reciters who have been so well documented by Vibeke Burdel, for example, or by my teacher Jacques Pampano. That's how I first came into contact with those performance traditions. And the whole history of 说书, right, of speaking book. And now one thing that's very characteristic, though, of the Chinese approach to these genres is the idea that the shu, the book, is always somewhere in the background, right? And this is, by the way, this is not a Chinese uniqueness. In India, you have people who will deliver oral recitations based on various sacred texts, but the book is always there on the table, and the reciter may occasionally open up the book and read a passage in Sanskrit and then go back to explaining it for hours and hours in Gujarati or Telugu or whatever. Right? But so, stories from Ramayana or from the lives of Krishna will be told in this way. There's a beautiful book about this, by the way, called 7 Days of Nectar by McComas, what's his name? McComas Thomas, I think, an Australian scholar of Indic things. So anyway, in India and China then, they have in common the notion that the book is there and is present, but it leaves a lot of space for the individual realization of it. So, and by the way, when I talk about epic, I by no means endorse the position that an epic is inherently admirable and everybody ought to have one, right? Plenty of things in China are just as interesting as epics and fall through the cracks of the Western classifications, right? So Yanyi would be one such example. So somewhere between Yanyi and Yeshi is a tremendous amount of creativity, which is consented to, I think, by audiences, right? If you look at the different editions of Sanguo Yanyi, episodes are handled differently, differently realized. The motivations of characters are different. It's like retellings of a story that's familiar but yet always needs to be reworked. And to this day, yeah. So, you know, that's just a dimension of the text that I think deserves to be brought out. You know. Thank you.
Haun, most of the forms that you just mentioned are urban forms of performance. Now, not all connections with the Yen-Yi traditions are urban, and not all of them are that closely connected with books. Up until very recent times, in the villages of Shanxi and Shanxi, what you found at the village level was martial arts clubs, so to speak, connected with cults of Songjiang and the Shuihu Zhuan. So the stories were connected with the actual performance of martial arts, or that is to say military training in villages, to form part of the village level spiritual militia that went along with religious procession, but also could actually fight with other villages if necessary. So this is actually much more of a kind of close link with the epic traditions that we find in other places.
Yeah. That's great. That feels much more epic to me.
So, if there are no other questions, I think that time is over for today. So, 谢谢苏老师的演讲，谢谢陆老师的回应，谢谢大家的问题。那我们下礼拜五4点在这边继续讨论这些问题。好，那谢谢大家。
OK，多谢。